Can you imagine a country with the largest oil reserves in the world falling into extreme poverty? Venezuela, once one of the wealthiest nations in South America, has experienced an economic shock that is almost unimaginable. How did this happen? How could a country with the richest natural resources in the world collapse? We will explore Venezuela's tragic story and uncover valuable lessons for the future. Venezuela was once an agricultural country, struggling with poverty like many of its Latin American neighbors. Before the discovery of oil in 1922, Venezuela's economy relied heavily on coffee and cacao exports, with small-scale manufacturing to meet domestic needs. But everything changed when oil was discovered beneath Lake Maracaibo. Within a few short years, foreign oil companies flocked to Venezuela, and the government's finances were filled overnight with revenue from oil exports. By 1928, Venezuela had become the world's second-largest oil producer and the #1 oil exporter. Oil accounted for 80% of its total exports and 42% of government revenue. In the 1950 seconds, the country's GDP per capita ranked 4th in the world, surpassing even war-torn European nations. Venezuela soon became the wealthiest country in Latin America, attracting immigrants from Europe and Latin America. But this sudden wealth, built on oil, raised a critical question. How did Venezuela, a country once struggling with poverty, become the economic powerhouse of the region so quickly? The answer lies in the ease with which the country tapped into its oil reserves. Unlike other industries, which require years of hard work, technology, and infrastructure development, oil offered immediate wealth. The government no longer needed taxes, and businesses had no incentive to innovate. Everything seemed to work as long as the oil flowed. Yet, there was a fundamental flaw in this prosperity, one that would later prove to be the country's undoing. The nation's reliance on oil had begun, and with it, an economic vulnerability that would eventually become clear. Would Venezuela be able to diversify its economy in time to avoid a future collapse? Or was it already too late? As Venezuela's dependence on oil grew, the nation's economy became increasingly fragile. The oil boom of the 1970s solidified the country's economic reliance on oil exports. And the Venezuelan government believed that the wealth generated from oil would last forever. But the oil boom wasn't without consequences. In the early 1970s, the price of oil skyrocketed, turning Venezuela's already prosperous economy into one of the wealthiest in the world. However, this prosperity came at a high cost. As oil revenues poured into the country, other sectors of the economy were neglected. Agricultural land was abandoned as farmers flocked to the cities in search of better opportunities. Factories shuttered, unable to compete with the flood of cheap imports paid for with oil dollars. As oil became the country's main source of income, the government relied more heavily on it, neglecting to diversify the economy. By the late 1970s, the oil industry accounted for 95% of Venezuela's exports and 80% of government revenue. The entire economy hinged on the price of a single commodity, and this made Venezuela extremely vulnerable to shifts in the global market. When the price of oil dropped, the country's economy began to unravel. The wealth that had once seemed endless suddenly felt like a curse, as Venezuela found itself trapped in a cycle of boom and bust. Was it too late for Venezuela to break free from this dependency? Or had the oil curse already taken root, setting the stage for the nation's eventual downfall? In 1999, Hugo Chavez assumed power with a promise to reshape Venezuela's future. Chavez, a former military officer, was elected on a platform of social reform and national pride. He declared the dawn of the 21st century socialism and began implementing sweeping changes, including the nationalization of key industries like oil. For many, Chavez represented hope, a leader who would take back the nation's resources from foreign companies and redistribute wealth to the poor. But while Chavez's policies garnered immense popularity among Venezuela's working class, they also raised significant concerns. In his effort to nationalize the oil industry, Chavez began to seize control of foreign-owned oil companies, forcibly reducing their shareholding to 49%. He used oil revenues to fund massive social programs that improved healthcare, education, and infrastructure for the country's poor. Chavez even went as far as to proclaim oil as the people's property. However, the decision to nationalize the oil industry would soon show its flaws. While Venezuela's oil wealth allowed Chavez to build a political base, It also undermined the country's ability to manage its oil industry effectively. Many of the oil industry's skilled professionals were replaced with loyalists who lacked the necessary expertise, and the nation's oil production began to decline. Meanwhile, as oil prices surged in the early 2000s, Venezuela became more dependent on oil revenue to fund social programs, further deepening the country's reliance on a volatile market. Was Chávez's socialist vision the solution Venezuela needed? Or were his decisions simply masking deeper, structural issues? Would the policies that endeared him to the people ultimately lead to the country's downfall? As the years passed, it became increasingly clear that the country was walking a fine line between short-term gains and long-term disaster. As the years passed, it became evident that Hugo Chávez's policies, while initially successful in gaining popular support, were not sustainable in the long term. By the time Nicolás Maduro took office following Chávez's death in 2013, Venezuela was already facing a deepening crisis. The country's dependence on oil had left it vulnerable to any fluctuations in the global market, and the sharp drop in oil prices that followed in 2014 revealed just how fragile the economy truly was. Maduro, Chávez's chosen successor, inherited a nation in crisis. Despite a brief period of high oil prices in the early 2000s, the lack of investment in non-oil industries, coupled with rampant corruption and mismanagement, meant that Venezuela's economy was teetering on the edge. The oil industry, which once fueled the country's prosperity, now faced declining production and obsolete infrastructure. The government's reliance on oil for nearly all of its revenue meant that any significant decline in oil prices would have catastrophic consequences. As oil prices plummeted, Venezuela found itself unable to sustain its social programs. Hyperinflation surged to record levels, the bolivar devalued drastically, and basic goods became scarce. Food and medicine shortages hit the population hard, and millions of Venezuelans fled the country in search of a better life. The government's response to the crisis was to print more money, which only worsened inflation. By 2018, Venezuela was experiencing an inflation rate that reached an unimaginable 65%, rendering the bolivar nearly worthless. Was Venezuela's situation beyond repair? Or was there still hope for a turnaround? Could future governments rescue the country from the abyss? Or had the damage already been done by years of corruption, mismanagement, and over-reliance on oil? As Venezuela's crisis deepened, it was clear that the nation had failed to adapt to changing circumstances, and its political and economic systems were not equipped to handle the pressures that had been building for decades. The dream of prosperity, once built on the foundations of oil, had collapsed into a nightmare. Venezuela's story is not just about the collapse of a nation. It's a stark warning to other countries rich in natural resources. The nation's downfall didn't happen because of a lack of resources. On the contrary, Venezuela's oil wealth was its greatest asset and its greatest curse. The tragedy of Venezuela is the perfect example of how an over-reliance on a single resource can lead to a collapse, especially when there is no plan to diversify the economy or prepare for unforeseen challenges. So, how can other nations avoid the same fate? The answer lies in the lessons from Venezuela's mistakes. The first lesson is the importance of economic diversification. Countries with abundant natural resources must invest in other industries, develop infrastructure, and build a sustainable economy that doesn't rely solely on global commodity prices. The second lesson is the importance of good governance and transparency. Corruption and mismanagement have devastating effects on any country, especially one with vast wealth. Without accountability, even the richest nations can fall victim to their own leaders' greed and incompetence. Venezuela's collapse also highlights the danger of political ideologies that place short-term gains over long-term sustainability. The nationalization of the oil industry may have seemed like a good idea at the time, but without the necessary expertise and investment in infrastructure, it led to the country's downfall. Similarly, the reliance on populist policies, while effective in the short term, failed to address the fundamental weaknesses in Venezuela's economy. The final lesson is one of resilience and adaptability. While Venezuela's path to recovery may seem uncertain, it's clear that any nation that faces similar challenges must focus on building a more diverse and resilient economy, strengthening democratic institutions, and preparing for an uncertain future. Venezuela's fall from prosperity to poverty is a cautionary tale. It's a reminder that resources alone cannot guarantee a nation's success. The true strength of any nation lies in its ability to adapt, innovate, and plan for the future.